Oh, thank you. Thank you to everyone at Cornell who supported and helped organize this talk. I'm excited to be here because I just returned from the border last week. In the past month, I've been traveling quite a bit. I got vaccinated, and so I've started doing traveling work, which is really completely stopped during the pandemic. So in the past month, I've been both on the Guatemala Mexico border. I was there working on a project interviewing migrant minors. So I think I have a pretty interesting perspective on the issue with minors arriving at the U.S. Mexico border. And then just last week, I was in McAllen, Texas, and Reynosa, Mexico, interviewing migrants. And so I'm basically going to take you on a trip along the border, because I think because of the pandemic in particular, nobody's traveling. There's very few people on the ground. A lot of people are curious what is happening now that we have a change in administration with a lot of these issues related to immigration. For example, family separation. Is family separation still continuing? Asylum. Can migrants request asylum? I find a lot of people are confused on that point. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. And part of my presentation is Polaroids, which I like using them because it's something that migrants can interact with. And especially when I'm dealing with people who have experienced a lot of trauma, or maybe they don't want to be photographed or they don't want to talk about certain things. With a Polaroid, I can give them a copy, and also tell them they can write whatever they want on it. So this first Polaroid is of it's basically migrants have set up camp in a park in Reynosa, Mexico, which is right across from McAllen. And I met a 19-year-old from Honduras, Kevin Arujo, and he wrote on the photo, "Never give up." He had just been expelled from the U.S., like almost everyone else at this camp, because of Title 42, which was put into place during the Trump administration, but the Biden administration has not changed it. And Title 42 was essentially using the pandemic as a pretext to say that because of public health, no one can request asylum, and so that is still in place. So migrants cannot request asylum. There are still some pathways into the U.S., but most migrants who cross into the U.S. are being directly expelled back to Mexico. And so one of the first issues I wanted to talk about was minors, because that's something that's been in the news a lot. And I know people have been asking questions, why are so many minors arriving? And this is a Polaroid I took of girls. They were bathing under hoses in Reynosa, Mexico. It's basically a public park. In McAllen, you can walk across the international bridge and you arrive in Reynosa. Reynosa is a cartel-controlled area of Mexico. It's quite dangerous. Migrants are often kidnapped. Very few journalists go there. If you look at reporting, there's not much reporting from Reynosa. And this park, basically, you cross the bridge and it's the first park you come to. And there's the entire park is filled with tents. And I know that when I was there, the city was threatening to, break up the tent camp because they don't want the migrants there. But part of the issue with so many migrants being expelled from the U.S. and not being able to request asylum is that they're not being deported back to their home countries, for example. So they're expelled to Reynosa, which is dangerous. They have no money. A lot of them are with young children, and they have to think, even if they wanted to go back to their home country, let's say Venezuela or Honduras, that's also going to be how do I get the money together to do that? Or do I want to stay and wait until asylum is once again, the established international right that it is, and I can request asylum. And so there were a lot of kids at the that were with some with parents and some traveling unaccompanied. And so I let the girls write on this note, and the one on the right, she wrote, um, her name was Stacy. She wrote, "Cree que haya un asilo para mí," which translates into, "Do you think there's asylum for me?" And it shouldn't be a question. She should be able to request asylum because that is an established right. And I don't believe it's a health issue at this point, because I'm sure we could test, asylum seekers for COVID at this point, or vaccinate them. We seem to have plenty of vaccinations in the vaccines, and I know a lot of people who are refusing to take them. So there's no reason that the asylum process should be shut down at this point. So I'm sort of gonna take you on a trip with migrants coming in from Mexico into the U.S. So I went to Roma, Texas, which is a point where coyotes, if you're a migrant, you can pay to cross the Rio Grande in a raft. And so I arrived in Roma, and it's basically just you park in the desert, and you walk down to the river. You have to cross a couple of fences, but it's a point where Border Patrol is set up. So people who cross they arrive and they're turning themselves into Border Patrol to request asylum. And the thing is, a lot of migrants are not aware of Title 42. They many of them think that Biden is perhaps more friendly to migrants. Some of them, a lot of migrants that I meet, they are illiterate, so they're not reading the news. They're not up to date on what's happening, and so they're not aware that they can't request asylum. And this is a Polaroid I took. I like it just because this is a raft on the river at night, and it gives you an idea. It's pitch black out. You're in the desert. You could easily get lost. And so here's a better photo. You can see the guy who's crossing them from the Mexico side is paddling with his arms. And then you can see it's a family lifting a child out of the boat at night. And so a lot of the people, at least the night I was there, a lot of the groups crossing the river were families with young children or unaccompanied minors. And then here you can see they cross the river, and they basically walk up a hill through the desert a little bit, and then there's Border Patrol agents waiting there to process them. So you can see that the flashlight is from Border Patrol agent. He's checking documentation. And so a lot of people were asking me, what papers do I need? Can I request asylum? What's the process? And so there's a lot of confusion about what Title 42 means, and who can. So even though you can't request asylum, you can get into the United States on a temporary hold, and different individuals who I interviewed did tell me about certain groups that are favored to get in on a temporary hold. And some of the ones I've seen, for example, a Cuban mother and daughter who got into the U.S. on a temporary hold, they have family in Florida, who could pay for their flight and promise that they, would be staying in the house of the family. And the mother, you can't work. You have a ankle monitor on you. So you can basically like uh, only leave the house to go to the grocery store and stuff like that. So if you are let into the U.S., it's on in this kind of temporary status, but it's not asylum. It's if asylum opens up, then you could request asylum, and you're not allowed to work, and you need someone, uh, you know, theoretically a family member who's a U.S. citizen who's willing to pay for your flight and let you live with them and things like that. And so here you can see this is the night that I was on the river. There were probably 200 migrants that arrived by the end of the night. I was there until probably 2 a.m., 2:30 a.m. And the border agents were processing everyone, making, they make everybody put shoelaces, rosaries, hair ties, baby dolls, all in. They basically make you put everything in plastic trash bags. Um, in the shoelaces and such, I think, is so that no one can do any self harm while they're in custody. And so from here, I wanted to go to the border wall in McAllen, Texas, because the border wall is another issue where I think some people imagine the border wall is this uninterrupted, um, long, beautiful wall. But the border wall is full of gaps. This is one of them. And it's under construction in many places. If even driving along the border for 30 minutes, you'll see all the gaps and all the places where there's piles of construction materials, essentially. And there's a lot of border agents. At least when I was there, there was a border agent right to the left side of this photo, and I wanted to take a picture of some of them. They wouldn't let me, but I talked to about 8 different agents, and they they were not. I had heard this. They're not really. They've gotten some criticism because they have not been very open to journalists, and so in response to me asking if I could take a photo, they asked to see my press card, and they took a picture of my press card. I don't know what they did with that, but I wonder, why did they need to take a picture of my press card? And so this is a construction site in the very far background. You can see the wall, it just ends, and then there's the future wall, and then there the wall ends again. So I just wanted to show this because I think if you're not living on the border, you might have a different vision of the wall. And here's the international bridge that you cross from McAllen into Reynosa. So you can just walk across. It's costs $1 basically to walk across. And you can see there was a really long line um, coming from the Mexico side into McAllen. Um, and after you cross that bridge, basically within 5 minutes, you're at this park in Reynosa, where the migrants who have been expelled from the United States are camping, or living in tents, essentially. And I gave this photo to a group of children. I like to think of creative ways to photograph children because I don't want to show their faces. I don't want to expose their identities, but I want to show their presence because they are children, and we need to treat them as such and with respect and dignity. And so these girls were playing, and they wanted to draw all over the photo, and I said, go for it. Uh, and I like what they did. Here they are. And this photo, so I met, and this is the first time I met a trans man who was traveling with his son. He is in the white shirt in the back of the photo. And when I gave him the photo, he's the one who wrote on the left side of the photo LGBT. I said, you can write whatever you want. And that's what he wrote. And when I asked him his name, he said Marta and Martin, because he would like to go by Martin, but his friends still call him Marta, and some of his friends at the camp. And he said he was very proud to be a trans man. And when I asked him what he was looking for in the United States, he said that, quote, freedom is not being discriminated against. And he hoped he would find a place like that in the US where he wouldn't face as much discrimination and where his son would not. And it was really interesting for me to talk to him. And I was at the park with a photographer who is a non-binary photographer from McAllen, Texas, and she recognized immediately. And this is something that I would not have known. She asked Martin if he needed a binder, because often trans men, if they haven't had top surgery, they will wear something to flatten out their breasts, essentially, and that makes them feel more comfortable. And so my friend asked him, do you need a binder? Is that something that would make you feel more comfortable? And he said yes. And so she was asking among friends to try and get him a binder. And I just tell that story because I think it's really important to work with diverse group of people, to work with non-binary LGBTQ community, because there's things that people recognize from their own experiences that you might, for example, that I didn't know about, and that I would not have recognized that need. And so on here they wrote, "We want political asylum, please." And so that's Martin. He was showing me his tattoos. He had several. He had 2 tattoos of his son's name, for example, one on his ankle and one on his arm. And you can see a little bit of where people are living. It probably looks familiar if you've seen photos from other of the tent camps. And I met this woman. I was walking around the camp, and I just started chatting with her, and she started crying. And she told me, and she started off talking about God and how she was praying to God. And then she told me that she had been separated from her 12-year-old son. And she didn't want to use her name, and she didn't want me to photograph her face. But this is the first woman that I have met that was separated from her child by or under the Biden administration. And so this is something that I wonder, Biden doesn't support child separation. He doesn't publicly support that policy. But, are some Border Patrol and ICE agents still, living with the ideas and the policies of the Trump administration? I'm not sure of the details of why she was separated from her son, but she said that it's very similar to the stories I heard under Trump, because what happened was she crossed the border with her son. So she's 55 and her son is 12. They're from Honduras. They crossed the border together. And when they went to request asylum, because they did think that they could do that, they never got the chance. But immediately They were separated. And she said that she was told that they were going to be processed at different facilities, and then they immediately deported her. And she told me, quote, "If I had known that I was going to be deported, I would have said to my son, 'Come with me.'" And so what's familiar for me in this story is that during the Trump administration, women who were separated from their children were not told, "We're separating you." They were told, "Oh, you have to go somewhere else. Your children need to shower. Or we're going to give them a snack." And then they were deported. And so that's especially cruel, as you can imagine, to not be told. And then she didn't know where her son was. And so she didn't want a picture, but I asked her if I could take a photo of her feet. I think feet tell a lot of stories as well. And she wrote on the note, "I love you, um, son. It was never my intention to leave you. You know that um, that it was that I was tricked. Essentially, take care of yourself, son." And so I would, in the future when I'm on the border, I want to see, is this something that's still happening? Or, are families still being separated? Because in theory, Biden does not support this policy, and he says he's reuniting families. Um, this is a couple from Honduras, and there you can see at the top of the um, Polaroid, they wrote "Asylum Biden President," and God bless us, and give us the opportunity to come legally and to reunite ourselves with our children. They have children who live in the U.S. and who are U.S. citizens who they hadn't seen in like 15 years or more. And this is so often the case. I mean, there are so many families that have been separated, and they want to be reunited, and they should be able to access their right to request asylum. And this is a photo of father and son. The father is 70 years old, um, and and he and his son and his son's wife were all living together in a tent. And I'm trying to see what he wrote. It's a little bit hard to read. um, so in the middle of, I was conducting interviews, and this is something I try to do whenever I can. I had been invited to speak to a fourth grade class in Reynosa, and it just happened to be that I was in Reynosa on the day that I was supposed to talk to them. And so I Zoomed these fourth grade students from the migrant tent camp. And they were just asking me questions about being a journalist and writing. And so I kind of loved that I got to talk to them. They were like, "Where are you?" I said, "I'm in Reynosa. I'm in the park." Um, but I just think it's important to really connect to the communities that you work in. Um, this is all a very human interaction. And this is Rena. She's 27. She's from Honduras. Pretty much everybody I met was from Central America. And she was traveling with her daughter, who is 9 years old. And she wrote, "God is good." A lot of migrants had religious messaging that they wanted to write on their Polaroids. And this photo I love because all these migrants, when they're expelled, they have to figure out ways to make money. And in this case, some of the women, including Rena, who you just saw her photo, Some of the women were making homemade face masks out of yogurt and sugar, and this Kevin, who's this migrant that I met, was getting a face mask from these women, and I like the photo because if you look at it, you think it looks almost like he's had some surgery or something, but he's actually just getting a face mask from women uh, at the migrant camp. And this is Rena with her daughter Ashley. Um, I wanted a way to capture, mothers and children, and to do it in a way that respected everybody. If people don't want to be in a photo, if they don't want to show their face, I always respect that, and I think that's really important. There's so many ways to tell a story, and you don't ever need to make someone feel uncomfortable or force someone to do something that they don't want to do. And this was the area where migrants were bathing and shaving and all of that kind of stuff. And this is a family this is a family from Honduras, and then the one guy in the reddish shirt is from El Salvador. And their story was interesting because the young man on the youngest man in the white shirt, he was traveling with his wife and son, and he he separated from them, so his wife and son crossed alone because he knew that there was likely a preference for mothers traveling alone with children. And it is actually true. What I was told is that the preference is for mothers traveling with children who are under the age of 6 to get into the US. Um, and so, and they did. They got into the US. He did not. He crossed on his own and he got expelled. And so he was happy because his wife and his son were in the US. And here, let's see, I'll go back. So, in terms of thinking about unaccompanied minors, something that I heard in interviews, which had a big impact on me, which I really haven't seen in discussions very much in the US, is that some of I interviewed mostly girls. Some of the girls I interviewed who were traveling alone were fleeing climate change, specifically the 2 hurricanes that hit Central America in November of 2020, which is Iota uh, and Eta. And so I met a 16-year-old girl who was orphaned by the hurricane, and she was traveling alone because she had some extended family members in the United States, and she wanted to be reunited with them. And I interviewed a psychologist who was working with minors, and she said she had seen a wave of minors who had either been orphaned or their houses had been flooded or swept away, um, and they were migrating for reasons related to climate change. And let's see, and also the mother who was separated from her children, she was fleeing the effects of the hurricanes. She said that her house had been destroyed by the flooding. Whole villages were underwater. There were landslides, and so in a lot of my interviews, what I was hearing was that people were arriving on the border as being pushed out of Central America due to the impact of the hurricanes, which had an economic impact and occurred during the pandemic, when people are already facing unemployment high unemployment and other issues like that. And so that's something that I wish we would talk about more. And I'm working on a piece for CNN about that right now. Let's see. Okay. And when I was working with Polaroids, one of the things I like is that I can also give photos to the people I interview. So you can see here, I gave a photo to this family and they wrote memories of the walk, recuerdo del camino, of the walk to the United States. And I really enjoyed, this is the first time I've worked with Polaroids, but especially after the pandemic, I really wanted to work with physical objects. I want to interact with the people that I'm working with, that I'm interviewing, in a way beyond, just interviewing them, to leave something with them and have them leave something with me, like a message or a note, because I think they can convey a lot of their experience through those notes, and they feel safe and they feel like they've been listened to. And so that's really what I'm working on right now in terms of the things that I'm doing on the border. And I wanted to go ahead and open this up to questions. If anybody has questions about either the Guatemala Mexico border or the U.S. Mexico border, and what is going on right now.
Thank you, Alice. That was very informative. We have a question from Ofelia Montelongo Valencia. She asks, is there a way we could volunteer in either side of the border?
There are ways to volunteer, but the first point that I always make, because a lot of people write me or contact me and say, I want to go to the border, but I don't have money, or there are ways to work wherever you are. First of all, for example, when I was living in Kentucky, which is where I did my PhD, I volunteered with a group of nuns who had lived in Central America, and they worked with the Hispanic community. So the first thing you can do is think, is there a way for me to volunteer where I am with migrants or with immigrants, or supporting immigrants in my own community? Because, and I say this because right now, because of the pandemic, all of the organizations I know that used to accept volunteers are not accepting volunteers, because we are still in the pandemic. Many people have not been vaccinated or are refusing to get vaccinated. And so I think volunteering is going to be a complicated issue, at least until 2022. So I doubt you can volunteer on the border right now, because you're more of a risk than anything else. And so I would really encourage you to think of places, especially if you have language skills. I used to volunteer as a translator. I worked with this group of nuns. I worked at an elementary school with students who were Spanish speakers. I mean, there's a lot of ways that you can interact with and support immigrant communities wherever you are.
Thank you. The next question, we had a question from Alejandra Molina. Are there reasons behind the decrease in the number of Mexican migrants attempting to cross the border? Were the migrants that you interviewed arriving with a caravan?
Oh, so none of the migrants I interviewed had arrived with a caravan. Although when I was in Tapachula, which is on the Rio Suchiate between Guatemala and Mexico. So I was there at the beginning of April, and when I was there, I heard of a caravan that was leaving from Honduras, but I haven't kept up with it, so I'm not sure If it's, I'm not sure where that caravan is, or if it, I mean, often caravans start and then they get smaller. But none of the people I interviewed had come with a caravan.
Thank you.
Hmm.
Kimiko Hirata has a question. What changes have you seen at the Guatemala-Mexico border under the Biden administration?
Well, that's an interesting question because the Guatemala-Mexico border, the president of Mexico, AMLO, was very much, in terms of his uh, policies and politics, he was very much in agreement with Trump. And he basically did everything that Trump asked and even more in terms of militarizing Mexico's borders. So when I was on the border of Guatemala and Mexico, the National Guard was everywhere. And that's been Mexico's response to migration, is a military response. And what I always say is you cannot out militarize climate change. The idea that you can beat people with, sticks or batons until they go home, because no, if you're an orphan and your parents have died and you're trying to reunite with family members in the United States, are you going to stop because, the National Guard comes to the border and, threatens to hit you? And that's essentially what, I mean, that the National Guard, what are they trained to do? It's a very odd response, but to me, because I go to Tapachula quite often, and so I've seen during the administration of AMLO, which, coincided with the years of Trump, that the response of the National Guard has been violence. And is that any way to deal with a humanitarian problem?
Thank you. The next question is from Jose Perez Setun. What is the process of interviewing minors, like children and teenagers? Is it different than interviewing adults?
It is different. I mean, it is different because, for example, so when I was interviewing minors on the Mexico-Guatemala border, I was working with UNICEF. And one thing is that it's extremely difficult to get access to the shelters where minors are held. And I've only ever had access twice. Once was with the UNICEF, and once when I was working in Reynosa, um, I was working with a photographer who spent a long time getting the permissions in order. And it makes sense, not just anybody is going to be able to access a space where minors are being held. And so part of the process is having, being aware of how to interview children who have likely been traumatized, not re-traumatizing them. And this was something that UNICEF is very aware of. In interviews, don't ever, focus on or dig into issues that, don't say, were you raped, or do you remember, all these kinds of insensitive questions that I do see journalists do this, or, um, or kind of ask for details about things that are traumatizing. And so that's what you really want to avoid. You want to give them a space to answer questions on their own terms. And when I'm working with minors, you're not taking photos of their faces. And even when I publish, I publish under pseudonyms. So it's a real effort to respect their privacy and their need for protection.
Thank you. Another question from Darian Peniche. It was reported that migrants were not informed on what they would need to do to request asylum, and that some migrants were unable to attend their hearings. Is this still the case during the Biden administration? Has this administration done something to address that?
So I believe this is still the case, that that some, but I'm not for sure because I haven't specifically reported on this. I've read other people's reporting, but I believe that some migrants have still missed their hearings due to being kidnapped, for example. And so this is an issue that where I feel like, um, the Biden administration needs to spend some time. Obviously, Trump made a lot of changes to border policies, and it will take time and effort to, respect human rights again, essentially.
Thank you. An anonymous attendee asks, and I would add, like in Reynosa, is there a presence of migrant aid organizations? Are Central Americans being helped in terms of mutual aid, or has the perspective from the Mexican government or local governments shifted? Have you seen any organizations or people that are stepping in?
So in Reynosa, the organization that I'm familiar with that has been doing work there is Doctors Without Borders. They do go to Cinda de Vida, which is one of they go to all the shelters, I believe, but Cinda de Vida is a shelter that I visited recently. And so they provide basic health care, and things like that, first aid to migrants.
Thank you. We had another question in the chat. Do you ever try to stay in touch with people you've met, since it's hard, the work that you do?
I do. I basically, I would say it's organic for me. I do stay in touch with a lot of people that I've met, especially most migrants are on Facebook. And I have, several people that I met when I first started reporting, on the border during the Trump administration. This was 2017, and one of the migrants I met at that time, he was probably 23 or 24, and I still write him to see. He actually just tried to cross the border a few months ago, and he got kidnapped by gang members and beat up. And he wrote me just to say, like, I'm in pretty bad shape, and I don't know what's gonna happen to me. But he said anyway, he's recovering now. He's so I keep in touch with anybody who who wants to to keep in touch with me. And it's heavy work, but I like following stories in the long term. And sometimes you don't know what a story is going to be until 3 years later.
Right. To the audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the anonymous submission form in the Q&A. I have a question for you, Dr. Driver. Can you talk a little bit more just about climate change in Central America, Southern Mexico, and how it's impacting quote unquote out-migration or sending communities, the nature of remittances, or even the costs of migration, indebtedness?
Hmm. So that's a great question. In terms of the cost, something I forgot I wanted to mention is that most of the migrants who I met just last week, they said that they paid about $5,000 per person, 5,000 USD per person, to for a coyote to guide them from Central America to the border.
Hmm.
In terms of climate change, when I'm interviewing is when I really think about climate change, because it's not. First of all, migrants are never going to. If I ask them, are you fleeing climate change? They're never going to respond, oh yes, I'm a climate change migrant. No, you really have to put these questions in other terms. Are you a farmer? Did you experience a drought? Did your family not have enough to eat? And when I'm interviewing women is when I really get into questioning, because climate change affects women and girls in very specific ways that I don't think are discussed enough. For example, I interviewed a young woman who was like, I think 21, but she had two kids. And the kids were old enough that I said, she had her first kid when she was 12. And so part of that is me recognizing, here's someone who had a child when she was 12, what was happening. And so it turns out her family, her father was a farmer from Honduras, and she's from a region that experienced extreme drought. And in her family, she was never allowed to go to school because when there's a drought, when families don't have enough money, who stays home? Girls. Girls are the first ones to stay at home, to deal with, making money or taking care of other kids or whatever it is, and the boys go to school. So this young woman that I met, she had never been to school. She couldn't read or write. She had one child, got pregnant at the age of 12. And also, if you think about, and I asked her, how old was your partner at that time? And he was like 25 years older than her. So that's statutory rape, and she would never describe it in those terms. But for me, all of that's tied up to climate change, because often all of these effects are, the gender dynamics of who is allowed to continue schooling, who isn't allowed to go to school, who has to work. And I meet so many women and girls who can't read or write. And that leaves you at such a disadvantage. And so when I'm thinking about climate change, I'm not just thinking about, the hurricanes, which are something more obvious. But the extended effects of climate change, you have to kind of dig into people's histories to figure out how it's affected them and what they're fleeing, because a lot of people aren't familiar with climate change language at all. So you're not going to get anywhere, talking about climate change with them.
Thank you. Another audience question. Did you see any individuals with active NPP cases being processed through Unhcr and using its app?
Oh, I did not. I wasn't aware of the app. I didn't see, no. Almost everybody that I interviewed had been expelled, or, well, in Roma crossing, that, they were coming in to request asylum. And then in McAllen, they had all been expelled from the US.
Thank you. There's some questions regarding indigenous communities in Guatemala with respect to climate change. Are indigenous communities responding in Guatemala to the challenges that it poses in unique ways? Do you know of any local groups that are doing positive work to respond to climate change and immigration in the country?
In this photo, the little girl in the red shirt, she told me, she told me in Spanish, she said, I speak another language. And I said, oh, what language do you speak? And she spoke to me in her indigenous language. And so definitely I did see some indigenous migrants from indigenous groups. And I know that there is work being done on climate change. It's in those communities, but it's not a subject that I have specifically reported on in Central America. And so I would have to do some research to direct you to groups of indigenous people that are working on climate change.
Thank you. If there are no other audience questions, oh wait, there definitely are. Okay. It sounds like migrants must travel with a lot of money. This seems very dangerous. That's more of a statement. If you were able to look forward to the next 4 years and had the ability to set policies, what steps would you take to impact change to this immigration situation?
I mean, in some ways, I don't want to say that it's simple, but it's a humanitarian issue. It's a climate change issue, and those, the climate change issue is complex because it requires, nations to work together. It requires, by-country work, Mexico, U.S., or bi-national work, and but I wish that we would, one, instead of militarizing the border, instead of spending this huge pile of money on the wall, what if we devoted that money to, dealing with climate change in Central America, for example, because you have to address the root problems of why people are leaving their countries. And then the second part of that would be that asylum is an established international right. It is a legal process that is widely respected. And so when migrants arrive at the US, they should have it should just be a process. It's a legal process. And it shouldn't involve militarization. It shouldn't involve detention, because when you're entering the US and you're requesting asylum, you are not a criminal. There is no reason that we should have these detention centers charging absolutely outrageous amounts of money, $700 a night. I've never even stayed in a hotel that costs that much, and migrants are we're paying that much per migrant to stay in places that we've seen are horrifying. And so I mean, it's clearly a case of where we're devoting money to, certain individuals and industries, essentially the prison industrial complex. And in migration, it shouldn't be terrifying. It's not, these are not criminals. These are children like the ones in the photo. And so for me, it's just, we just need to really change the way that we think about it. These, rather than assuming that this is terrifying and these are criminals, these are all the people who are going to make our food, process our food, pick our food. And I know that because I just did a large story on meat processing workers who were essential workers during the pandemic. Who do you think they are? They are all from Central America. They are considered essential workers. Many of them died of COVID. And yet we have such a disrespect for immigrants who come here to work. And so it's just, our whole concept is wrong about the way that we treat and discuss immigration.
Thank you.
John, if I think we may have gone through the questions in the queue. I wanted to pose a final question if I could. I'm not able to put it in the queue, but Alice, as I listen to you, I can't help but wonder what kinds of information the migrants are working with, and how much confusion or how much disinformation are they being exposed to? Because and recognizing, of course, that we've just had a change in administrations and supposedly significant changes in terms of what U.S. policies are. Although, as you mentioned, it's in some cases it's not clear that things have actually changed in the direction that they were supposed to. But to what extent? What are the expectations of the immigrants as to what they expect when they come to the border and they want to apply for asylum, or what are they anticipating, and what is the reality? What is the gap between their expectations and the reality that they're encountering when they get here?
So the first gap is, many of them expect that Biden has made asylum, that they can request asylum now. They think, okay, the president has changed, asylum is open again, we can request asylum. And so that's the biggest gap, because that's not true. And they're not aware of Title 42, or they don't know what that is, which I find actually with a lot of people in the US also don't know what Title 42 is. So the second gap is that many of them think, and this is somewhat correct, but not exactly, they think that mothers crossing with children alone are given preference. And at least from what I heard in interviews, that's not exactly correct. It's mothers with children under 6. So for example, the woman whose son was 12 who was separated, perhaps if he had been under 6, they would have both gotten in. I don't know. And this lack of information is, I also am unsure of what the preferences are. Different people told me different things. Um, and so those are two of the kind of the gaps that I noticed in my interviews.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Alice. We have time for one last question from the audience. But if not, I'll just say thank you again so much, Dr. Alice Driver. And if you like, you can put your first page up with your Instagram and your Twitter. I encourage everyone who uses those services to follow Alice there. And thank you again.
No, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it. It was very inspiring and moving to see your photos and hear the stories.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, everybody who's attended.